So hello, everyone. Welcome to Audubon Society of Central Arkansas's monthly meeting. I'm the Vice President, Dan Scheinman. And tonight I'm happy to introduce our two speakers. We've got Ben Blankenship and Sadie Walker. Ben Blankenship is a senior double major in biology and French at Hendrix College. His primary interests are conservation science, ecology, and the study of evolution processes. Following graduation, Ben plans to attend grad school and work towards a better understanding of human impacts on ecosystems. Sadie Walker is a senior health science major at Hendrix College. Her primary areas of study are biology and chemistry, but she's also drawn to ecology. And after graduating from Hendrix, she plans to attend grad school and study genetics and forensic science. And in addition to the research that they will be presenting tonight on birds and fracking, both of them have spent the summer of 2021 studying the impact of deer decomposition on prairie plant and insect communities, as well as banding birds for the Monitoring Avian Productivity and Survivorship Program, the MAPS program, under the guidance of Dr. Maureen McClung, who is also with us tonight, and she's an associate professor of biology at Hendrix. So I will give the floor to Sadie and Ben. Take it away.
Hello, everyone. Good evening. First, I want to thank you all for having Sadie and I. It means a lot. I'm excited to talk about some birds. And I will go ahead and share my screen and hope that there are no technical difficulties. Okay, how is that? Can everyone see?
Yeah.
Awesome, thank you. All righty, so hello. Sadie and I are here to talk about the research that we've been collaborating on, which involves the usage of the breeding bird survey to understand current bird population trends relationship to oil and gas development in the United States.
Are you changing the slides? Because it's showing you're frozen on my screen.
Oh, is it not changing?
Nope.
Oh no.
Looks like you're not in presentation mode.
Yeah, could you put it in presentation mode? Are you using a Mac or a PC, Ben?
I'm using a PC.
I know on a Mac you press Command Enter and it automatically goes in, or there you looked like you were on it just there. Slideshow and then start from first slide maybe, or current. Yeah, see what happens.
How's that?
Interesting. It's still not going into full slideshow mode.
Oh, that is so weird. When Sadie and I were practicing, it looked like it seemed like it was transitioning all right.
Maybe try going back to our Google Slides and just put it in presentation mode like we had done.
Okay. Yeah, I will attempt to do that. And then share screen. Share. Slideshow. Okay, how's that?
That's good now.
Okay, awesome.
All right. This project investigated the connection between oil and gas development and bird abundance. Our main goal was to see whether or not development and bird abundance are related. In addition, we sought to see if habitat preference of bird species is a factor in predicting response to oil and gas. Our main question is here on the slide. It is, how has unconventional shale gas development impacted avian populations in the northeastern USA?
So for this study, we looked in the northeastern US in what's called the Marcellus Utica Shale. Marcellus Utica refers to these big swaths of sedimentary rock, which encompasses the area highlighted on the map here. These areas contain deposits of oil and natural gas, which have been accumulating over thousands of years. And we often refer to these as plays, which is just an industry term used to refer to areas where oil and gas companies are actively exploring and extracting oil and gas. Companies have been extracting oil and gas from these regions for decades, but only in the past few decades has activity really kind of picked up. And one reason for this is because of a term that you all actually might be familiar with, called fracking.
So fracking is a shortened term for hydraulic fracturing. In fracking, pressurized water laden with sand and chemicals is pumped into the ground in order to fracture the rock and release the gas or oil trapped there, which then that flows into the wells. First, a well has to be drilled. The drilling can be done both vertically and horizontally. And in recent years, the horizontal drilling has become more common because companies can reach more area from one well pad. The combination of horizontal drilling and fracking has become known as unconventional oil and gas. Conventional oil and gas typically moves or involves drilling a vertical well and relying on the natural pressure of the well in order to get the oil from the rock to the surface. The problem with this is that over time, the natural pressure of the well can decrease as the oil or gas depletes. Unconventional oil and gas techniques allow companies to reach previously inaccessible areas to get more product out of each well, hence the rise in the popularity.
So there are many environmental impacts that have been associated with shale gas activity. The image shown on this slide is from an article published in 2014, which reviewed these impacts. These impacts range from water contamination because of exposure to fracking fluids, greenhouse gas emissions, and noise pollution, just to name a few. The impact we are most interested in, however, and that will be the topic of this talk, is the one shown in the white box right here, which is land use changes. Because oil and gas extraction requires space for wells, it can cause a habitat reduction.
So oil and gas extraction requires space for the well pads and other infrastructure. All of this development leaves a characteristic footprint on the landscape. Seen here is a satellite image of this infrastructure, including well pads shown by the W, frac ponds where water is held, also shown by the W, pipelines for moving the product shown with a P, and roads to access the pads represented with the R. The other infrastructure that can be seen is a compressor station, but it's not pictured here. This development shows and or modifies the habitats. It can also fragment the landscape. This once contiguous block of forest now has had forest removed and been fragmented by roads and pipelines. We have long known in the field of ecology that changes such as these bring with them not only complete loss of habitat when it is removed, as it is done with the well pad here, but also changes in temperature, moisture, and plant community and animal community composition. The development in the Marcellus Utica Shale stands to change habitat availability for birds and other wildlife.
So this study looks specifically at the correlation of what's known as bird habitat guild to responses to oil and gas development. These habitat guilds refer to the habitat that is preferred by a bird species. So in this study, the habitat guilds assessed were early successional, shown here. These are areas that have good amounts of disturbance, mostly composed of shrubs and forbs and grasses. An example would be grasslands and the edges of forests. And some examples of birds that have a preference for this specific habitat guild would be indigo buntings, wide-eyed vireos, and common yellowthroats. The second habitat guild that we looked at is what's known as forest interior, which, as the name suggests, is a habitat full of dense forest cover and a closed tree canopy. And some birds that you expect to find here would be black and white warblers, eastern wood pewees, hairy woodpeckers, and rose-breasted grosbeaks. And the third and final habitat is what's known as synanthropic. This habitat refers to areas very close to human civilization and very affected by human disturbances the most often. And you would find brown-headed cowbirds, purple martins, eastern bluebirds, and Carolina chickadees within this guild. So many of you might be familiar with this little guy. This is the brown-headed cowbird, fairly common in Arkansas, and an example of one of our synanthropic species, the species which thrive when in close association with humans. So you find these most often in urbanized areas and very human-dominated populations. They're known for being brood parasites, So essentially what they do is a female cowbird will come in and lay her eggs in the nest of an unrelated species. And that mother, that unrelated mother, will actually do the parenting for this female cowbird. And sometimes the brown-headed cowbird chick will actually eject the other adoptive siblings from the nest. So this reproductive strategy has raised concerns about whether this behavior is actually leading to the decline of other bird populations. And I have an example. I hope that you all can hear this. So I will play this. This is an example of a brown-headed cowbird call. You all hear that? Okay, awesome, fantastic. So yeah, very trilly, metallic-y sounding call.
So the wood thrush here is an example of a forest interior species. It's a bird that prefers to live within dense forest cover. They have a distinctive melodic song for which they are well known, and they're actually declining in North America. This decline has been linked to habitat loss and possibly cowbird parasitism. You won't really see these birds in your backyard, but you can definitely hear them if your yard backs up to the forest. So we also have an example of its song.
Okay, I hope you all heard that as well. For some reason, I can't hear the audio on my end, so I'm just hoping for the best. All right, awesome.
Yeah, you're good. It's going through.
So an example of one of our early successional species is this guy, the Indigo Bunting. These guys are found in grasslands and forest edges and have this very distinctive, brilliant blue plumage and are known to be vigorous singers. They sing all day long. A very common mnemonic that helps birders remember their song. It sounds like fire, fire, here, here, where, hurry, hurry. So I'm going to play a little video. Maybe you can recognize that in this. So indigo buntings respond very well to forest disturbance since they like that early successional habitat. So when trees are removed or fire thins out the canopy, that's when the indigo buntings move in and kind of colonize an area. And a fun little fact about these guys, which I find super interesting, is that they actually use their internal clock to adjust to the movement of the stars in the night sky, which I think is beautiful.
So as you can imagine, folks are worried about the impact this activity has on birds because this region is an important breeding ground for resident and migratory species. Some field studies have approached this question by looking at bird communities. A study by Thomas and colleagues in 2014 on conventional oil and gas development in Pennsylvania found that abundance in forest interior species decreased, while early successional and synanthropic increased. This area in Pennsylvania doesn't have the same footprint, but it shares similarities in that there are well paths, roads, etc. These graphs on the left show how the abundance of these groups at well sites compared to reference sites where there is no well pad. Again, you can see that forest interior species declined and early successional and synanthropic species increased. Another study by Farwell and colleagues in 2016 examined the diversity of these guilds and found a similar pattern for species richness. These graphs on the right show how forest interior species richness declined during the fracking boom, where gas development was present, but where gas development wasn't present, which is shown by the top graph, the early successional and synanthropic species diversity increased, which is shown by the bottom two graphs. And when we talk about interior species richness, we mean that it's a measure of diversity.
So we decided to use data from the North American Breeding Bird Survey to investigate whether birds in the Marcellus Utica region are responding to land use changes associated with oil and gas development. The BBS is a cooperative effort between USGS and Environment Canada to monitor the status and trends of North American bird populations. This citizen science avian monitoring program has been going on in the US and Canada since the 1960s. So each spring, over 2,500 skilled birders and professional biologists come in and volunteer their time to participate in the BBS. They run roadside surveys along established routes throughout the continent. And the data generated from these efforts are used to estimate population trends for use by conservation managers, scientists, as well as the general public. So the data are freely available to the public, and so we decided to make use of it for our study.
So the main objective of this study was to assess the correlation between bird population change and well development and distribution. Our data and analysis focused largely on how changes in habitat due to fracking affected avian population trends. We hypothesized that a decrease in abundance of forest interior species and an increase of synanthropic species in the areas impacted by well development would occur.
So for our study site, we developed a 50 by 50 kilometer grid to divide our study area for analysis. The grid is seen here in blue, these little squares. Then all of the BBS routes within the grid system, shown here as these little black squiggles that are kind of dotted around, were analyzed for bird trends. That is, are the species increasing or are they decreasing along these routes? And the gray dots here represent well sites. You can see that these sites are not random, but clustered in certain areas. So some grids have very few, some have, they're completely absent, and some have, tons.
We used the national database hosted by the company Enveros to determine the number and type of unconventional wells in each grid cell. The figure on the left shows a zoomed out view of the way the wells appear scattered throughout a grid cell. The wells are shown by all the little green dots, and the orange lines outline the grid cells. The right figure shows a zoomed in view of a well pad with a well on the top. The well pad are the gray rectangles you can see coming off the road, and the green dot is the well on top. The Enveros database provides location information, the type of well, the production type, and dates associating with its drillings. You can have type of wells that are either vertical or horizontal, and the production type is either oil, gas, or both.
So this slide shows before and after impacts of shale gas development. This was an area of relatively intact and mature forest, but now with the pad and the road, it's been developed and fragmented. This slide also shows how we went about measuring impact. When we trace the area of development, seen here in red, as well as modification, seen here in yellow, Google Earth Pro provided the actual area calculation. We then developed a mathematical model that allowed us to estimate the amount of area per grid cell that was impacted by development based on the number of wells in each grid cell.
As we mentioned earlier, to estimate changes in bird abundances in communities, we use the Breeding Bird Survey database. This database is publicly accessible and free to use through the USGS website, and USGS stands for United States Geological Survey. We collected all the detection records for each route in our study area between 2005 and 2019, and we assessed bird trends during this time period because these are the years that correspond to the boom in drilling in this region.
So once we collected all of our detections across these routes and years, we recorded a handful of covariate traits for each species detected. We wanted to include these factors in our analyses to assess how they may relate to the species or community trends. So breeding habitat guild, nest placement substrate, diet, size, distribution, and synanthropy status were collected from or assigned based on information from species accounts from the database Birds of the World, as well as other previous research. And then conservation status was based on scores from the NABCI, which stands for North American Bird Conservation Initiative.
So the standard methods we used were BBS methods. We used this to estimate trends for species abundance, and this told us whether bird numbers were increasing, decreasing, or staying about the same. We also modeled our trends using the species characteristics and land use variables, and these told us which factors were most important in determining the species trends.
So we estimated that 9,900 hectares of land was developed or modified due to unconventional oil and gas development in this region. This is a relatively small amount of area, only about 0.02% of the region, but the impact actually varied greatly between grid cells. And some nearly 1% of the land within the grid cells were impacted. It's also important to keep in mind the impacts of fragmentation. Many other studies have shown that fragmentation has deleterious impacts on some species.
We actually ended up with a very large data set with over 2 million observations. While we pulled 180 total species, we did not include all of these in our analysis because not all species detected were seen frequently enough to analyze the trends. Vagrants and species with very few detections were excluded.
So the graph here on the left shows the abundance trend on the horizontal axis, which refers to whether the total number of birds was going up, if it was going down, or if it was staying the same. The number of grid cells with that trend is displayed here on the vertical axis. What we can see here is that while most grid cells showed modest increases, some showed large declines, and a very few showed very large increases. So the graph on the right shows the species richness trend, which refers to whether the number of species was increasing, decreasing, or staying the same within a grid cell. And what we see here is that there was much variation in species richness trends across grid cells. Some grid cells showed richness as increasing, others as decreasing. And this is what you'd expect if fracking development was affecting bird numbers, because remember that there was lots of variation in the level of land use impact across grid cells. If you remember, there was grid cells that were very clustered with well sites, and others had very few wells.
Two environmental factors that affected bird trends were the amount of developed and modified land and the proportion of forested area. No surprise, because we know birds respond to habitat changes. They affected synanthropic and non-synanthropic birds differently. The graph on the left shows the amount of land developed or modified by the fracking. We can see that synanthropic birds significantly increased in areas with more land developed, and that non-synanthropic birds showed a non-significant trend, which means that this amount of developed and modified land had no effect on them. The right graph shows that the amount of forest cover also affects bird trends. The synanthropic birds declined with increasing forest cover, but again, there was no effect of forest cover on non-synanthropic birds.
So when we looked at individual species trends as they relate to the environmental factors that were important in predicting trends, we found that species on the left increased as development increased, and only the ruby-throated hummingbird decreased.
Continuing with looking at the species trends, we also found that as forest cover decreased, the species to the left had positive trends and the species on the right had negative trends. Some with the increasing were the herring gull, the willow flycatcher, and the blue grosbeak, and some that decreased were the downy woodpecker, the eastern bluebird, and the chipping sparrow.
So in summary, we did find that birds responded to an increase in unconventional shale gas development. However, the responses weren't exactly as we predicted. While we found that synanthropic birds, the birds that thrive in the human-dominated landscapes, increased with development, non-synanthropic did not show any responses to development, which was an interesting find.
So we only studied one shale play, but there are others all across the US that are experiencing even higher rates of development. Studies done by our research supervisors, Dr. McClung and Dr. Moran, have shown that millions of acres have been impacted. And sometimes it's in areas of good habitat for birds and other wildlife, such as forests, grasslands, and deserts. It's possible that with more time, shale oil and gas could be changing community composition, to favor certain species, and our study would suggest it favors synanthropic species. So the question is, what can we do to minimize impacts of shale oil and gas development? Perhaps we could avoid higher quality habitats when planning development. An example of this would be, instead of putting a pipeline straight through a forest, companies could use existing roadways for pipeline placement. The wells do run dry and then they're abandoned. So right now there is little regulation or funding for restoration of well pads and their associated infrastructure once the wells run dry. The land just sits there doing nothing. Another strategy employing restoration would be to have a compensatory mitigation sort of system where if certain lands are going to be developed, then others should be restored.
So we're going to go ahead and close by making a plug for the breeding bird survey and how you can go about getting involved. So I'm going to take the time to kind of walk you guys through the BBS website portal so that if you're interested, you know how to kind of go about navigating it. So let's see if I have it pulled up here. So if you head to the main website page for BBS, you can go ahead and click vacant routes under get involved. And it loaded. Okay, awesome. And then you can select United States, Arkansas. And this will show the both the assigned and the available routes. So what you want to do is find one of the available routes marked in red, click info, and it will bring up the contact information for the state coordinator, who, if you're interested in getting involved, you would reach out to. It is important to note that the qualifications that you need are access to transportation, you need good hearing and eyesight, the ability to identify birds by both sight and sound, and lastly, you'll need to complete the BBS methodology program, which you can receive through your state coordinator.
So we had a lot of help throughout this project. Here at Hendrix, we were helped by Chandra Jackson, Dr. McClung, and Dr. Moran. Over at A-State, there was Kevin Crazier, Peridot Galloway, and then at University of Georgia, we had Michael Crosley, Olivia Smith, and William Snyder. And with Audubon, we had Tim Meehan.
Now we want to take this time to answer any questions if you guys have them. Yeah.
Oh, I have a few.
Yes.
Since I'm from Pennsylvania and I'm pretty familiar with all this darn fracking that was going on, where did you pull any of the grids from Pennsylvania and where were they?
So I believe Pennsylvania is within the Marcellus Utica
Yes, it is.
region. Yes. So we did pull from this area.
You don't know which ones?
You can go back and show the slide that has the picture of the Marcellus Shale region to kind of show.
Yeah, but I didn't see which. Yeah, I mean, I'm in Northeast. I grew up in Northeastern Pennsylvania, which is one of the big, heavy gray dots. So let me tell you about the land up there. It was small farms once upon a time. Dan probably knows this because he went to Cornell. And they reforested. So the mature forest that you were seeing probably grew back up when the small farms were all abandoned. And so it'd be interesting to compare, the birds from maybe the 1950s to now. There might not be as much differentiation as you think. And I can tell you that even after they finish drilling a well, there is a whole lot of noise, and the roads up there are terrible. This is all it's all Ozarky, except that they're mountain ridges. They're not the little hills that we have here, and they go on forever. So awful lot of truck traffic. The wells make noise. It's not just the deforestation, and I mean that area where I'm from is heavily fracked and wells all over the place. So I think there's probably more effects than you're even accounting for, because I mean, the truck traffic is just ridiculous up there on 2-lane roads, up with switchbacks and all that. It's a mess. So, I'd just be curious to know, how much the birds have changed during this development compared to when all the farms were there.
I think that would be incredibly interesting to look at. Like you said, if we were to pull data from the 1950s and compare it to now, our study looked at the years between 2005 and 2019, I believe.
Right.
So it would be super
So
interesting.
let me give you an example. I mean, I grew up on a dairy farm. We mowed hay, and I can tell you, I never saw a bobolink. And I know bobolinks are a grassland bird. I was out in those hay fields. I never saw one. I went back up after, they stopped mowing all the fields when the bobolinks were nesting, and I started seeing them everywhere. So that was a huge change. I'm sure they're probably not too fond of the wellheads. Anyway, that's my 2 cents. It's a region in transition, and probably won't ever be like it was.
Yeah, thank you for that. That would be really interesting to look back and see how it was in the 50s compared to now.
Yeah, I have one other comment, and this is a little bit of a digression. Has anybody ever seen the movie Gasland? That was it was sort of an anti-fracking movie. It was made the next ridge over from where I grew up.
We had Josh Fox come talk at Hendrix, and there was a showing of that when the boom was happening here in the Fayetteville Shale. So yeah, he actually came and hosted a screening at Hendrix.
Yeah, I knew all those families.
I just want to jump in and remind people, if you have questions, you can either type them in the chat box or you can unmute yourself. And we do have a question in the chat box. George wants to know, what would be the effect if fracking for gas and oil were completely eliminated?
Oh, if it was completely eliminated?
Yeah, if it stopped today, what would happen to the birds?
Well, I mean, if we didn't have fracking at all, or any oil and gas development in the United States, I think we would expect to see an increase in those forest interior species with the rise of dense forest cover and that dense canopy, but probably a decline in some of those synanthropic and early successional. And synanthropic, like you remember, they thrive in human-dominated landscapes, and the early successional do very well with disturbances. So if fracking was eliminated completely, I think that would be the trend that we'd expect to see.
Thanks. Can you go back to the slide where you show the individual species and whether they're increasing or decreasing by forest and such? Yeah, well, next one. Yeah, that one. Thought it was interesting, as forest cover decreases, that house sparrows would decrease and barn swallows would decrease.
Yeah, we did see a lot of very unexpected trends. And again, this could be, we did make use of citizen science, the breeding bird survey. And so the actual methodology for this survey could have impacted the actual bird trends that we were observing, because it relies very heavily on individuals hearing and seeing birds. And so that could have impacted something.
Sure, and it's roadside and it goes by ponds and all sorts of habitats, not necessarily anywhere near a fracking pad.
Okay, so my 2 cents for that is there's a lot of buildings that are falling in and not there. And the landscapes aren't maintained because the family farms have been abandoned. So I would see where the house sparrows might be disappearing because it's less of a habitable place for them. Barn swallows, there's not as many barns there as there used to be.
Yeah, I think it's important to think about how, one of the goals of this research was to track whether or not these trends that studies were finding, you know, on the ground that were real targeted, you know, asking, does oil and gas development influence these bird numbers? See if the BBS could detect the same sorts of trends. And the answer is kind of, but maybe it doesn't map on as precisely as it would. And it makes sense, like what Ben was saying about how, you know, the data, they're essentially kind of noisy because there's, you know, the birds are observed in a different way, and it's citizen science, and, you know, you'll have a couple years where a route isn't run and then it'll get picked up again. And so there's actually a study that came out just this last year out west that did a similar analysis to this, which we were excited to see someone looking at the same question in the West. But, you know, it's kind of cool that we were able to pick up something with this large data set on such a very specific question, right? Not just asking overall trends, but actually tying it to one specific type of land use change. But to Carolyn's point, there's a lot of other stuff going on here. There's forest succession happening. There's, you know, all those other impacts of fracking. And so it's hard to tease out precisely what's going on, but synanthropics do seem to be doing better around this behavior.
The other thing that I've noticed when you know, during this period when I was up there in my area is that there were a lot more new buildings being built. A couple of farms were developed and they sold lots, 10-acre lots, and they had houses on them where there were cow pastures. I mean, this is out in the middle of freaking nowhere. Be like, you know, putting in a housing development in Jasper. You know, it was very wrenching to see that because, you know, this is so far from anywhere. So I think that the changing land use patterns in these areas also, in addition to the fracking, are probably making a difference. And you're seeing some of that in the bird numbers.
Another question in the chat, Mallory wants to know, what was each of your favorite birds to study and why?
Oh, I love this question. I think for me, my favorite bird was probably the brown-headed cowbird. I think their behavioral adaptation is super fascinating. And yeah, I think that's probably my favorite.
Yeah, my favorite's the wide-eyed vireo. There was a picture of it on our last slide, actually. I like their notable white eye. And then also we did some work with them this summer when we did the bird banding. We caught a few of them and they have a really fun little sassy attitude. So I enjoy working with them. They're my favorite.
I'd also like to draw attention to this photo right here. This is a brown-headed cowbird chick in the nest of a yellow warbler, I believe. You can see how out of place it is. I think that's very funny.
So presumably, well, who owns the land these fracking pads go onto? This is predominantly private land?
It's on private land, but I think the company actually owns all the stuff that's there, and you know, they do not want you anywhere near them. They're all fenced, and they're, you know, huge keep out signs, kind of like up around Cleveland County and northern Faulkner County.
I can tell you how that works here. Is that they lease the mineral right, the private landowner that owns the service and the mineral rights, because those are actually separate things. Whoever owns the mineral right can lease it out, and they compensate the landowner for you know, the area where the pad is and the road and all that, and all that's negotiated out. But if the landowner and the mineral rights are the same person, then they get whatever portion of the mineral rights is. A lot of times that's been divided out a bunch of times through the years. But anyway, there's compensation for both surface and mineral.
Right, but the question, the idea that the pads go dry and they're abandoned, but there's no
Mhm.
restoration done is really interesting. It's like you just leave the private landowner holding the bag and they've got this scar and no money
Well,
to fix it.
you can negotiate that to where they have to fix it, but a lot of people don't. Because, they think, oh, it's going to be producing for X number of years. It won't be my problem then.
Most of the people who sold their mineral rights didn't know what they were getting into.
Exactly.
They sold them cheap and didn't have any legal representation. And yeah, there was no negotiation for what to do when the wells ran dry.
And there's actually a national organization for mineral rights owners that can, give you hints on how to do that and what you can ask for and what the going rate is. But, if someone shows up in some of these places out in the boonies waving some cash, people don't know about all that stuff.
It just seems like an opportunity for conservation the same way that mine reclamation is being treated sort of somewhat consistently. And, maybe it's a federal program that needs to be created for that kind of thing if one doesn't exist, or something that may have to pay for.
You are speaking straight to a paper that Dr. Meringue and I published a few months ago, all about the potential for reclamation of wells in the US, and how we actually showed that within 5 years, you break even with minimal investment on reseeding and revegetating these in terms of ecosystem services like carbon sequestration and agriculture, like in the form of reseeding pasture for cattle farming. So it's actually surprising how quickly you get a return on that investment with pretty minimal effort when it comes to restoration. But there's no regulation. It varies so widely from state to state. It's all over the place. And yeah, I'm all for restoration and some more regulation on how that gets done.
Yeah, the leases I've seen, since a lot of times it is farmland, they are more concentrated on not taking the use of the farmland now. So they have phrases about either pipes, electricity, whatever it is, has to be below plow depth. They can't have it up where they're going to hit it when they're plowing the field and those kinds of things. And very little about eventually when it goes dry. Because, that if the same person on the surface in minerals, they're planning on getting a check every so often on a regular basis for decades.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I'm from one of those heavily fracked areas, and I can tell you there's no interest in environmental restoration. That's pretty much, a non-starter. There's very little farming up there because the land is worth more for the mineral rights and for selling them for housing development. Maybe you'll get some interest there. It's a rather backward area. And most of the farms in Pennsylvania where that's been fracked, the farmers aged out and the kids just said no. So, the fields were going back to woods, and over in Western Pennsylvania where the mountains are even bigger, they probably just did lumber. That was probably what it is now. Yeah. Because, there's no significant industrial agriculture in northern Western Pennsylvania, maybe around Philly, Lancaster County, places like that, but not up where I'm from.
And also a question in the chat, John wants to know if you were able to exclude other variables like suburbanization, recreation, logging, other activities that affect the landscape and the birds.
So as far as I know, we didn't really have a method to excluding them, but something that Ben and I spent a lot of time doing was looking through Enveros at all the grid cells. And when you zoom in to see the wells, oftentimes, I won't say this for all of them, but oftentimes it's surrounded by wooded area. So it really isn't affected as much by the suburbanization or the increase in recreation because it's just the well pad and then a bunch of woods. So we were getting results from just in that area.
And that brings up another question that I had is how the heck, you may not know the answer to this, but how the heck do they determine they're in the middle of the woods, far from anything, they should put a well pad? Like someone was just walking through the woods over hill and dale, doing whatever they do, mineral surveys to figure out there's oil and gas under there.
That is a very good question. I have no clue.
I think they drilled wherever they wanted to, or wherever they thought, they could get into and get enough water to do the fracking. There didn't seem to be any rhyme or reason in my particular area.
Yeah, but it's just at least from the one image that they showed, it was just in the middle of the woods, and then the road they create is just it's not a straight road for sure. So it seems like whoever created the road was just meandering through.
They
least
took
resistance
chainsaws
to
and
there.
bulldozers. I can tell you what they did, because I've seen some of that stuff, and I mean, they just destroy it.
Yeah.
Well, and two, with the horizontal fracking, it's a huge controversy about just because you drilled it here doesn't mean you're not taking minerals from under that I own under my land next door. And why am I not getting my cut? It's all, and it's who you can negotiate with to get your equipment in and get it leased.
Yeah, so something that both Sadie and Ben experienced looking at the maps of Enveros is that you can actually turn on layers that show you horizontal wells, and it looks like fireworks coming out of a well. And so if you had access to Enveros, you would actually be able to see and doing some investigation and see if your neighbor's well is actually tapping into the mineral rights underneath your land. Enveros is something you typically have to pay for, but they do provide free access for academic research, which is wonderful because it changed the way we can do this type of research. But yeah, it's interesting, that point, Dylan, about you actually don't know. You could have your natural gas being fracked, but it's hard to tell because they can drill so far away from an actual well pad.
I'm just amazed that all this stuff is available on GIS. You'd think the companies will do their darndest to make sure that none of that stuff is publicly available.
Well, and I think they have for decades, and I'm not exactly sure how Enveros got it all. Maybe it's because they did have people pay for it for so long, but we did research on this for about a decade before we realized this resource was available. And it, like I said, it completely changed the game, because before then, we'd have to like find the state agency that managed it and like hope that they kept their data up to date, and that was typically not the case. And so it was kind of this scattershot attempt to pull together data. So Enveros, we're eternally grateful for access to that information.
So Dan, I actually just got sent an answer to your question about how they find the spots. Geologists provide input for subsurface conditions, and they can find the pockets within formations below grade. So that's how they figure out where to put the wells.
Did they do that with sound waves or explosives or what?
I'm not sure.
I'm sure the surveyors are thrilled they have to trek through wilderness to go find the one spot somewhere.
Oh, the more interesting thing is they had to determine who owned the land. And so they were up at the county government, clogging up all the old deed books that were in the historical society. That was kind of interesting.
I've actually seen recently where somebody like inherited it, 3 generations back or whatever. And people are trying to hunt them down,
Exactly.
Because people don't realize that, those mineral rights and surface have been separated, that kind of thing. It happened a lot in Oklahoma.
Yeah.
Any other questions? All right, folks. Thank you very much, Sadie and Ben, for your great presentation. I really enjoyed watching your team effort, your tag team there. And also, it's always great to see undergraduates doing research and giving public presentations. It's a great experience, and I'm sure it will pay off for you in the long run. So good luck in your schooling and going to grad school and all that good stuff.
Thanks, and thank you for
so
having
much.
us.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate it.
Thanks everyone for joining us, and stick around for the rest of our meeting.